A man attacked me, and my only hope for survival was a bottle of vitamins and a lie. I was walking home from work around 11 at night, and I decided to take a shortcut through a quieter residential street instead of staying on the main road. I'd walked that way a few times before, and it was fine, just faster than the main route. It was dark, but the streetlights were on, and I could see houses with lights in the windows. About halfway down the block, I heard footsteps behind me, and when I glanced back, there was a man maybe 20 feet away walking in the same direction. I told myself it was fine, and he was probably just going home too. I kept walking and tried not to think about it. But then I sped up a little just to test, and I heard his footsteps speed up too. My heart started pounding, but I tried to stay calm and told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was just in a hurry. I crossed to the other side of the street thinking that would make me feel better. When I looked back, he'd crossed too. That's when I knew something was really wrong. I started walking even faster and pulled my phone out of my pocket thinking I should call someone. Before I could unlock it, I heard him running. His footsteps got louder and faster, and I started running too. But I was wearing heels from work and I couldn't move fast enough. I felt his hand grab my arm hard and I tried to pull away, but he was so much stronger than me. I dropped my phone and heard it clatter on the sidewalk. He started dragging me toward an alley between two buildings, and I was screaming as loud as I could. "Help! Someone help me!" My voice echoed off the buildings, but no one came out. No lights turned on. No one opened a door. The street stayed dark and empty. He put his hand over my mouth and nose, and I could barely breathe. He pulled me into the alley, and it was so dark back there I could barely see anything. He shoved me hard against the brick wall, and the impact knocked the wind out of me. My back hit the rough bricks, and pain shot through my shoulders. I was kicking and trying to fight him off with everything I had, but he grabbed both my wrists with one hand and pinned them above my head. His grip was crushing my wrists together, and I could feel bruises forming. I kept trying to scream, but his other hand was still over my mouth. I tried to bite his hand, but I couldn't get my jaw open enough. I tried to reason with him through gasping breaths. "Please don't do this. Please just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I promise. I won't go to the police." He didn't say anything at all, just kept holding me there with this blank expression on his face like I wasn't even a person to him. I tried threatening him next because nothing else was working. "People know where I am. My boyfriend is waiting for me at home. He knows I'm walking home right now. They'll come looking for me any minute." He laughed at that, actually laughed, and said, "No one's coming. No one even heard you screaming just now, and we're not that far from the street." I realized he was right, and that made everything so much worse. I could feel him tearing at my shirt and the buttons were popping off. I knew what was about to happen. Pure terror washed over me like nothing I'd ever felt before. My mind was racing through everything I'd ever read about situations like this, every article and every self-defense tip I'd ever heard. I remembered reading that you should try to humanize yourself, make them see you as a real person with a life. "I have a family," I said, and my voice was shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. "I have a mom and a dad and a little sister who's only 15. People who love me and need me. Please don't do this to them." He told me to shut up and pressed his hand over my mouth again even harder. I was sobbing and my whole body was shaking, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew I needed to keep thinking clearly. I needed to find something that would actually make him stop, because nothing else was working. Not screaming, not reasoning, not threatening, not begging. That's when I remembered an article I'd read years ago about women who'd survived attacks like this. One of them had lied about having a disease and the attacker had backed off immediately. I looked him right in the eyes and said as clearly as I could, "I have HIV. He stopped moving for just a second and stared at me. Then he said, "You're lying." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control them, but I reached into my purse that was still hanging off my shoulder. I dug around until I found the bottle of vitamins I took every morning and pulled it out. I held it up between us so he could see it and prayed desperately that he wouldn't look too closely at the label, that he wouldn't realize it just said daily multivitamin on the side. He stared at the pill bottle in my shaking hand. For maybe 5 seconds, he just kept staring at the bottle, his eyes moving from the pills to my face and back again. Then his hands dropped from my wrists and he stepped back fast like I'd burned him. His breathing was loud and rough in the dark alley, and I could see his expression change from that blank look to something like fear mixed with disgust. He took another step back and his mouth moved like he was saying something, but I couldn't hear the words over the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. Then he turned and ran toward the street entrance, his footsteps echoing off the brick walls, and I watched him disappear into the darkness of the residential street beyond. I stood there frozen with my back still pressed against the rough brick wall. My legs were shaking so badly I thought they might give out completely, and I'd just collapse right there in the alley. My shirt hung open where he'd torn it, and I could feel the cool night air on my skin. The buttons were scattered somewhere on the ground around my feet. My wrists hurt where his fingers had crushed them together, and when I looked down, I could already see dark marks forming. I was still holding the vitamin bottle in my right hand, gripping it so tight my knuckles had gone white. The alley was completely silent now, except for my own breathing, which sounded too loud and too fast. In the distance, I could hear his footsteps getting quieter as he ran further away. I needed to move, but my body wouldn't respond to what my brain was telling it to do. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few more seconds, I made myself push off from the wall. My legs were trembling and unsteady under me as I walked toward the alley entrance. I kept looking around in the darkness, checking every shadow, terrified he might come back. When I reached the street, it was still empty and quiet, with those same streetlights casting their yellow glow on the pavement. My phone was lying on the sidewalk where I'd dropped it when he first grabbed me. I bent down to pick it up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The screen had a crack running across it in a spiderweb pattern, but when I pressed the button, it lit up, so at least it still worked. I stood there on the empty street holding my cracked phone and trying to make my brain work properly. I needed to call someone, but everything felt weird and disconnected, like I was watching this happen to someone else instead of living through it myself. My fingers felt numb as I unlocked the phone and pulled up the keypad. I dialed 911 and lifted the phone to my ear. When the operator answered, her voice sounded far away, even though I knew the phone was right against my head. My own voice came out strange and flat when I started talking, like I was reporting that my car had a flat tire instead of describing how a man had just attacked me. The operator asked if I was safe now and where the attacker was, and if I needed an ambulance. I told her I was alone on the street and I didn't know which direction he'd gone after he ran. She said officers were already on their way to my location, and I needed to stay on the line with her. Her voice stayed calm and steady while she asked me more questions about what happened and whether I was hurt. I answered as best I could, but the words felt jumbled in my head, and I wasn't sure if what I was saying made sense. She kept me talking, asking about my location and nearby street signs, and I realized she was trying to keep me grounded and present, instead of letting me drift away into that disconnected feeling. 2 patrol cars came down the residential street maybe 3 or 4 minutes later, their red and blue lights flashing and bouncing off the houses and parked cars. The lights seemed too bright after the darkness of the alley, and I had to squint against them. The cars pulled up near where I was standing, and 2 officers got out of each vehicle. They approached me carefully, and one of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, came closer while the others hung back. She asked if I was injured and if I needed medical help right away. I looked down at myself and saw my torn shirt hanging open, and the dark bruises already forming on my wrists. I realized I didn't actually know if I was hurt beyond what I could see because everything felt numb and far away, like my body belonged to someone else. The female officer took off her jacket and draped it around my shoulders to cover my torn shirt. The jacket was warm from her body heat and smelled like coffee and fabric softener. Her partner, a tall man with a buzz cut, walked past us toward the alley entrance with his flashlight out. The woman officer started asking me gentle questions about what happened, and I tried to explain, but the words came out in the wrong order. I'd start a sentence about him following me, and then jump to being in the alley, and then back to hearing his footsteps speed up when I sped up. She was patient and didn't rush me. Just let me tell it however it came out. When I got to the part about the HIV lie and held up the vitamin bottle that I was still clutching in my hand, I expected her to look confused or skeptical. Instead, she just nodded and said that was really smart thinking and it probably saved my life. Hearing her say that made something crack inside my chest, and I felt tears start running down my face even though I hadn't realized I was crying. The officer asked if I wanted to go to the hospital, and I hesitated because what I really wanted was to go home and take a shower and pretend none of this had ever happened. But she explained about evidence collection and medical examination, and how important it was even though he didn't complete the assault. She said they needed to document my injuries and collect any evidence that might help them identify and catch him. The thought of more strangers touching me and asking me questions made me want to cry harder, but some part of my brain that was still working properly knew she was right, and I needed to do this. I agreed to go, and she helped me into the back of one of the patrol cars. At the emergency room, a nurse came out to meet us at the entrance. Her name tag said Victoria Rivers, and she had kind eyes with lines at the corners like she smiled a lot. She spoke softly and took me to a private examination room away from the busy main waiting area where other people were sitting with various injuries and illnesses. The fluorescent lights in the examination room were way too bright after the darkness of the alley and the street. The hospital smell of disinfectant and something else I couldn't identify made my stomach turn, and I thought I might throw up. Victoria explained each step of what was going to happen before she did anything, telling me I could stop at any time if I needed to. Her steady, calm presence helped me stay in the moment instead of drifting away into that disconnected feeling. Before the medical examination started, another woman came into the room and introduced herself as Miranda Stevens, a crisis counselor. She pulled up a chair and sat down at my level instead of standing over me the way the police officers had. She asked what I needed right now, not what happened or what I should do next, just what I needed in this exact moment. Without thinking about it, I said I needed my sister. Miranda helped me find Jasmine's number in my phone even though my hands were still shaking too much to scroll properly. She dialed it for me and held the phone up to my ear. Jasmine answered on the second ring, sounding instantly alert even though it was after midnight. The moment I heard her voice saying my name with that worried tone, I started crying again, harder this time, and I couldn't get words out for a few seconds. When I finally managed to tell her I was at the hospital and I needed her to come, she didn't ask why or what happened, just said she'd be there as fast as she could. 45 minutes later, Jasmine walked into that examination room, and even though she's only 15 years old, she looked ready to fight anyone who tried to hurt me again. Our parents must have tried to stop her from taking an Uber across the city in the middle of the night, but somehow she'd convinced them to let her come. She came straight to where I was sitting on the examination table and took my hand in both of hers. She didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to answer, didn't push me to explain what happened, just stayed solid and present beside me. When Victoria came back in to start the evidence collection, Jasmine squeezed my hand tighter and started talking about completely random things like her algebra teacher's terrible toupee and how her friend got detention for passing notes in history class. Her voice kept me anchored to reality while Victoria photographed my bruised wrists and torn shirt, swabbed under my fingernails, and combed through my hair looking for possible evidence. Every time I started to drift away into that disconnected feeling, Jasmine would squeeze my hand or say something that pulled me back. The sane nurse finished photographing my wrists and moved to my torn shirt, asking me to hold it open so she could document the missing buttons and ripped fabric. Her camera clicked several more times and each flash felt too bright in the small room. She put down the camera and picked up what looked like a small comb, explaining she needed to check my hair for any evidence the attacker might have left behind. I sat still while she worked through sections of my hair, her gloved hands careful but thorough. Jasmine kept talking about her friend who got caught passing notes in history class, something about the teacher reading the note out loud to embarrass them. I focused on her voice instead of what was happening to me. The nurse moved to my hands next, using what looked like a wooden stick to scrape under each fingernail and seal the samples in tiny envelopes. She labeled each one with a marker and added them to a growing pile of evidence bags on the counter. The whole process took maybe 40 minutes but felt like hours, my body going through the motions while my mind floated somewhere above it all. When she finally said she was done and stripped off her gloves, I felt Jasmine's grip on my hand loosen slightly. A man knocked on the door around 3 in the morning and introduced himself as Detective Dylan Holden when Victoria let him in. He looked maybe 40 with lines around his eyes that made him seem tired, like he'd seen too many rooms like this one with too many women like me. He apologized for the timing but said early evidence collection was important for the investigation. His voice was quiet and professional, not pushy or demanding. He asked if I felt up to giving a statement and I said yes, even though sitting there talking about it was the last thing I wanted to do. Everything felt far away and unreal, like I was watching this happen to someone else on a TV show. Jasmine squeezed my hand and Detective Holden pulled up a chair, taking out a small notebook and pen. I walked him through everything from the beginning, starting with leaving work and deciding to take the shortcut through that residential street. He wrote quickly but didn't interrupt, just let me talk at my own pace. I described hearing the footsteps behind me, testing by speeding up, crossing the street and seeing him cross too. My voice sounded flat and mechanical, recounting how he grabbed me and dragged me into the alley, how I tried everything to make him stop. When I got to the part about the HIV lie and the vitamin bottle, Detective Holden's pen paused for just a second, but his expression didn't change. He asked what the attacker looked like, and I gave him what details I could remember in the darkness. Maybe 6 feet tall, average build, dark jacket. I couldn't see his face clearly in the alley. He asked which direction the man ran after letting me go, and I pointed vaguely toward where I thought the street was. Then Holden looked up from his notes and asked directly if I actually had HIV. I admitted it was completely made up, just my daily multivitamin that I grabbed from my purse. He nodded slowly and said that kind of quick thinking under that much pressure was remarkable, that the lie probably saved my life. Holden closed his notebook and his expression got more serious. He explained gently that without knowing who the attacker was, or having clear camera footage from that residential street, the investigation was going to be hard. He promised to check every security camera in the area and compare my case to other similar attacks in the database. But I could hear something in his voice, a careful tone that was preparing me for bad news. He was telling me the guy probably wouldn't get caught without actually saying those words. The reality of that hit me hard, making it difficult to breathe normally. This man who attacked me was just out there somewhere walking around free, maybe already watching another woman on another dark street. Jasmine's hand tightened around mine again. The ER doctor came in around 5 in the morning and said I was cleared to go home. She handed me prescriptions for emergency birth control and antibiotics, just as a safety measure even though the attack didn't get that far. Victoria came back in with a stack of papers about follow-up HIV testing, explaining that since I told the attacker I was positive, I needed to document that I was actually negative. I would need tests now, then again in 3 months, possibly 6 months to be completely sure. The whole situation felt absurd and complicated, needing HIV tests because of my own survival lie. I took all the paperwork and added it to the pile of discharge instructions and police report copies, too tired to process any of it. Jasmine insisted on coming home with me even though I lived alone in a small 1-bedroom apartment with only my bed. She was already texting our parents while we waited for the Uber, typing out some edited version of what happened. I was grateful she was handling that because I couldn't face explaining any of this to them yet. The sun was starting to come up when we got outside, early morning light making everything look normal and ordinary. The Uber pulled up to my building and I stared at the familiar entrance thinking the world should look different somehow after what happened to me. But it just looked like my building on a regular morning, people leaving for work, someone walking their dog down the sidewalk. Inside my apartment, I went straight to the bathroom and turned on the shower as hot as it would go. I stood under the water for almost an hour, scrubbing my skin with soap over and over until it felt raw and too sensitive. Jasmine sat on the bathroom floor on the other side of the shower curtain, talking about random things that didn't matter. Her voice reminded me I was safe now, that I was home and the door was locked. But I didn't feel safe even in my own shower with my sister right there on the other side of the curtain. I wondered if I would ever feel safe again anywhere. The hot water started running cold before I finally made myself turn it off and get out. I couldn't sleep even though my whole body felt heavy with tiredness. Every time I started to drift off, my body would jerk awake, heart racing like something was wrong. Jasmine lay next to me in bed, scrolling through her phone, occasionally showing me funny videos she thought I would like. I tried to focus on the videos but couldn't really process what I was seeing. Around noon, Jasmine ordered food delivery because neither of us had eaten anything since before the attack. When it arrived, she brought it to the bed and we sat there with the containers open. I managed a few bites before my stomach turned and I had to stop. The idea of doing something as normal as eating lunch felt impossible to figure out. My phone had been buzzing on and off all morning, and when I finally looked at it, there were 17 missed calls and dozens of texts. Most were from my coworkers and my shift supervisor asking where I was and if I was okay. I realized with a jolt that I never called in to work, and my shift had started 6 hours ago. Panic hit me thinking about getting fired on top of everything else. Jasmine saw my face and took the phone from my hands before I could spiral. She typed out a text to my supervisor saying I had a family emergency and wouldn't be in for a few days. It was technically true even if it was missing the actual context of what happened. Detective Holden called that afternoon and I almost didn't answer. He said they found my phone's location data and confirmed the route I described, which matched up with everything I told him. They were going door to door in that area looking for security cameras that might have caught something. He was also checking the database for similar attacks with the same pattern, men following women on quiet streets late at night. His tone was still professional, but I could tell he wasn't particularly hopeful about finding the guy. I appreciated that he wasn't giving me false hope or making promises he couldn't keep. When we hung up, I set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, Jasmine quiet beside me, both of us knowing the man who attacked me was still out there somewhere. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone started buzzing again, and this time it was Milo's name on the screen. I stared at it without moving, my thumb hovering over the decline button. I didn't know what to say to him or how to explain any of this. Jasmine glanced over from where she was sitting cross-legged on my couch. She asked if I wanted her to answer it, and I felt so relieved I almost started crying again. She took the phone from my hands and answered with a calm voice I couldn't have managed myself. She told him I was dealing with something serious and would call when I was ready. I heard his voice on the other end asking questions, but Jasmine stayed firm and said I just needed some time. When she hung up, she set the phone face down on the coffee table and went back to scrolling through her own phone like nothing had happened. That first night was worse than the attack itself in some ways. Every sound in my apartment building made me jump. Someone's door closing down the hall sounded like footsteps coming for me. The pipes creaking in the walls sounded like someone trying to break in. I kept thinking he somehow followed me home and knew where I lived and was coming to finish what he started. I got up and checked that the door was locked. Then 5 minutes later, I got up and checked again. Then again. Jasmine watched me do this 3 times before she finally got up and dragged a chair from my kitchen table. She wedged it under the doorknob like they do in movies, and somehow that ridiculous gesture helped more than the actual deadbolt. I managed to close my eyes after that, even though I didn't really sleep. The next morning, Jasmine had to go to the school, but she didn't want to leave me alone. I insisted I was fine, even though we both knew I wasn't. She made me promise to call her every 2 hours, or she was skipping class and coming back. I promised, and she finally left, looking back at me 3 times before she closed the door. After she left, the apartment felt too quiet and too loud at the same time. Every creak of the building settling made my heart race. Every distant voice from another apartment made me freeze and listen. I tried to distract myself with TV, but the first channel had a crime show with a woman being attacked. I changed it and found a movie where a man was following a woman down a dark street. I changed it again, and there was a news report about sexual assault statistics. Everything seemed to feature violence against women. I turned off the TV and sat in silence instead. My mind kept replaying the attack in loops. I kept analyzing every moment and wondering what I could have done differently. The rational part of my brain knew this wasn't my fault, but the rest of me kept making a list of my mistakes. Taking the shortcut instead of staying on the main road. Wearing heels that made it impossible to run fast. Not calling someone the second I heard footsteps behind me. Not fighting harder when he grabbed me. Not screaming louder even though no one came when I did scream. The list kept getting longer every time I went through it. Around 11, there was a knock on my door and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I looked through the peephole and saw Wyatt from work standing there with grocery bags. I opened the door and he came in with a concerned expression on his face. He said the supervisor told everyone I had a family emergency, but he knew me well enough to know something else was wrong. He set the bags on my kitchen counter and started putting things away without asking. I ended up telling him a simple version of what happened. I said someone attacked me while I was walking home, but I got away. He stopped putting groceries away and looked at me for a long moment. Then he asked if I was okay, and I said I didn't know. He didn't push for more details or ask questions about what exactly happened. He just finished putting the groceries away and said he could stay for a while if I wanted company. No pressure. Having Wyatt there helped more than I expected. His presence made the apartment feel less like a trap I was stuck in alone. He talked about boring work drama and gossip about our coworkers. He didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile or about to fall apart. When I zoned out mid-conversation and stared at nothing for a while, he just waited patiently until I came back. He didn't ask what I was thinking about or try to pull me back into the moment. Before he left, he found a marker and wrote his number on my fridge. He said to call anytime, day or night, if I needed anything or just wanted someone to talk to. On day 3, Detective Holden called with an update that wasn't really an update. They found one security camera on that street that caught a distant figure running, but the image quality was too poor for identification. He was still checking the database for similar cases, and he would keep me informed. But I could hear in his voice the thing he wasn't saying. This case was already going cold. Without a clear image or a witness who saw his face, they had almost nothing to go on. The attacker was out there somewhere, maybe watching other women on quiet streets, and there was nothing I could do about it. I thanked Detective Holden for calling and hung up. I forced myself to call Milo back that afternoon because avoiding him was only making the anxiety worse. When he answered, his voice was tight with worry, and I could hear the frustration underneath it. Frustration that I'd shut him out and let my sister answer his calls instead of talking to him myself. I told him what happened in flat sentences that sounded like I was reading from a police report. Someone attacked me walking home from work. I fought him off and got away. I went to the hospital and gave a statement to the police. I left out the worst details because I didn't have energy to manage his emotional response on top of my own. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then he asked what he could do, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. Milo came over that evening, and the visit was awkward and strained in ways our relationship never was before. He kept trying to hug me, and each time my whole body stiffened up. My muscles locked and my breath caught, and I couldn't make myself relax into his arms. It was like my body was reacting before my brain could override it. He looked hurt and confused each time I pulled away. I felt guilty for not being able to give him what he needed, but I also couldn't force myself to accept physical comfort I wasn't ready for. We sat on opposite ends of my couch with too much space between us. We had a difficult conversation where Milo admitted he didn't know how to help me and felt useless watching me struggle. I told him I didn't know what I needed either. I was just trying to get through each day without falling apart. He asked if we were okay, if our relationship was okay, and I was honest that I didn't know the answer to that either. Everything felt uncertain now. It was like the attack had shaken loose all the foundations I thought were solid, and I didn't know what was still standing and what had crumbled. On day 5, I had to go back to the clinic for HIV testing because of the lie I told to save myself. The nurse at the front desk handed me forms to fill out, and I sat in the waiting room feeling weird about the whole thing. My survival trick had created this strange medical paper trail where I needed to prove I was negative when I'd claimed to be positive. A counselor called me back and explained the testing process in a calm voice that made it sound routine, even though nothing about this felt routine to me. She said I'd need another test in 3 months and maybe another one at 6 months to be completely sure. Standard steps, even though the actual risk was small since he didn't finish what he started. I nodded and let her take my blood and signed more forms. The irony sat heavy in my chest, but I didn't say anything about it. When I left the clinic, I felt exhausted, like the appointment had used up all my energy for the day. Jasmine started showing up at my apartment every day after school. She'd walk in with her backpack full of homework and set up camp on my living room floor like it was the most normal thing in the world. Our parents still thought I'd been mugged and shaken up, but nothing worse than that. Jasmine and I had agreed not to tell them the real story because Mom would fall apart completely, and Dad would want to hunt the guy down himself. The secret felt heavy every time I talked to them on the phone and heard the concern in their voices. They kept asking if I was okay, and I kept lying and saying I was fine. Snudda. Jasmine would give me these looks when I was on the phone with them like she knew how hard it was to keep up the act. But we both knew telling them the truth would make everything worse right now. Mom would want me to move back home, and Dad would probably do something stupid trying to find the attacker. So we kept the secret, and it sat between us and them like a wall we couldn't tear down. I tried going back to work after a week because I couldn't afford to miss more shifts, and I thought maybe getting back to normal would help. I drove to work and parked in the lot and sat in my car staring at the building. My chest started getting tight and my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. The thought of walking to my car alone after my shift ended made my vision go narrow and dark at the edges. Even though the parking lot was well lit and there were always people around, my brain couldn't process that as safe. I couldn't make myself open the car door. My breathing got faster and faster until I was gulping air and my whole body was shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually Wyatt knocked on my window and scared me so badly I jumped. He looked worried and opened the door carefully. He said maybe I wasn't ready yet, and his voice was gentle like he was talking to someone who might break. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't get words out past the panic. He walked me back inside to talk to our supervisor about taking more time off. My shift supervisor sat across from me in his office, and I tried to explain that I needed more time without telling him why. He was surprisingly understanding even though I kept the explanation vague. He approved 2 more weeks of unpaid leave and said my job would be waiting when I was ready to come back. I thanked him and felt relief mixed with stress about money. Missing 3 weeks of work meant my next paycheck would be tiny and I still had rent and bills to pay. The financial pressure added to everything else I was dealing with, but I couldn't imagine working late night shifts right now. The thought of being at work after dark made my chest tight again. I left his office, and Wyatt walked me back to my car and waited until I drove away. Detective Holden called a few days later with news that wasn't really good news. He said they'd found 2 other women who reported similar attacks in the past 4 months in neighborhoods near mine. Same pattern every time. Following women on quiet streets late at night, dragging them into isolated areas. One woman fought him off and got away. The other escaped when a car drove by and scared him off. None of the descriptions were detailed enough to identify him, but the pattern was clear. I wasn't his first target, and I probably wouldn't be his last. Holden's voice was professional, but I could hear the frustration underneath. He promised they were still investigating and checking for any evidence that might lead to an ID, but I knew what he wasn't saying. Without a clear image or someone who saw his face, the chances of catching him were getting smaller every day. The knowledge that he was still out there hunting other women made me feel sick. I kept thinking about some other woman walking home alone, and him following her the same way he followed me. My rational brain knew it wasn't my fault he was still free, but the guilt sat in my stomach anyway. I called Holden back and asked if I should go public with my story to warn other women. Maybe if I described what happened, it would help someone avoid the same situation. But Holden explained gently that without identifying details, it might just create panic without actually preventing anything. He said I should focus on my own recovery while they kept investigating. His words made sense, but they also felt deeply frustrating. I wanted to do something useful instead of just sitting in my apartment trying to feel normal again. Miranda Stevens called to check in, and I almost didn't answer because I was tired of talking about what happened. But she was persistent, and eventually I picked up. She asked how I was doing, and I gave her the standard answer that I was fine. She didn't buy it, and recommended a therapist named Natalia Rocha who worked with trauma patients. I told her I wasn't interested because the idea of talking about the attack over and over with a stranger sounded exhausting. But Miranda explained that trauma therapy wasn't just talking about what happened. It was learning tools to manage the intrusive thoughts and physical reactions I was having. She said Natalia could teach me ways to cope with the panic attacks and hypervigilance. I finally agreed to one session just to get Miranda to stop calling. She sounded pleased and said she'd have Natalia's office reach out to schedule something. My first therapy session with Natalia was in a small office in a medical building downtown. The waiting room had calming colors and soft music playing, but I still felt tense sitting there. Natalia came out to get me, and she was younger than I expected, with dark hair pulled back and a calm expression. Her office had comfortable chairs and tissues on every surface, which made me wonder how many people cried in there. She didn't push me to tell her details about the attack or process feelings I wasn't ready for. Instead, she taught me grounding techniques for when I started dissociating and breathing exercises for panic attacks. She explained that my hypervigilance and sleep problems were normal trauma responses. My brain was trying to protect me by staying on high alert all the time. She said it didn't mean I was weak or broken, just that my body was reacting to a real threat the way it was designed to. Somehow that clinical framing helped more than sympathy would have. It made the panic attacks and constant fear feel less like personal failures and more like predictable responses I could learn to manage. Jasmine noticed I wasn't eating much and started bringing specific foods she knew I liked. She'd show up with my favorite takeout or snacks from the store and sit with me until I ate at least some of it. She didn't lecture me about needing to eat or guilt me about worrying her. She just made it easier to do the basic thing of feeding myself when my appetite had disappeared. I realized my 15-year-old sister was taking care of me in ways I should probably be embarrassed about, but mostly I was just grateful she was there. She'd sit on my couch doing homework while I picked at whatever food she'd brought, and her presence made the apartment feel less empty and threatening. 2 weeks after the attack, I decided to try walking outside alone during daylight. Natalia had suggested starting small and building up my tolerance gradually. I made it 2 blocks from my apartment before my heart started racing and my hands got sweaty. Every man I passed on the sidewalk looked like him for a split second before my brain registered it wasn't. A guy walking his dog. A teenager on his phone. An old man with a cane. My body reacted to all of them like they were threats. By the 3rd block, I was convinced one of them actually was him and he was following me again. I turned around and practically ran back to my apartment. My hands shook so badly I could barely get my key in the lock. Once I was inside with the door locked, I felt like a complete failure. I'd only made it a few blocks in broad daylight on a busy street. When I told Natalia about it in my next session, she said this was normal and recovery wasn't a straight line. She explained that pushing too hard too fast often backfires. She suggested starting even smaller, like just standing outside my building for a few minutes, and gradually building up my tolerance to being outside. The idea of having to relearn something as basic as walking outside made me want to cry, but I knew she was right. That evening, Milo came over to my apartment, and the moment he walked in, I could feel the tension between us. He sat on the couch, and I sat in the chair across from him instead of next to him. He noticed, and his face fell a little. We talked for almost an hour about how things had been since the attack. He admitted he was struggling with feeling shut out and not knowing how to help me. He said he felt useless watching me go through this and not being able to fix it. I told him honestly that I didn't know when or if I'd be comfortable with physical intimacy again. Even hugging felt threatening right now. My body went stiff every time someone touched me unexpectedly. He reached out to take my hand, and I pulled back automatically before I could stop myself. The hurt in his eyes made my chest ache, but I couldn't force myself to accept comfort I wasn't ready for. We agreed to take things day by day with no pressure or expectations. but I could see the exhaustion in his face from constantly walking on eggshells around my triggers. The uncertainty was wearing on both of us, and neither of us knew if our relationship could survive this. In my next therapy session with Natalia, she brought up the idea of a support group for assault survivors that met weekly. I was immediately skeptical because sitting in a circle sharing trauma sounded like my personal nightmare. But she explained it wasn't really about sharing graphic details. It was more about learning from other people who understood what daily life looked like after assault, how they managed triggers and rebuilt their sense of safety. She said hearing from people further along in recovery could give me hope that things might get more manageable. I agreed to try one meeting, though I was already planning to sit silently in the corner and just observe. She gave me the address and meeting time and reminded me I could leave any time if it felt like too much. The support group meeting was in a community center basement with terrible fluorescent lighting that buzzed constantly. Metal folding chairs were arranged in a circle, and there were 6 other women already there when I arrived. They ranged from early 20s to maybe 60 years old. A woman named Beth, who facilitated the group, explained the ground rules. Everything said in the room stayed confidential. No one had to share if they didn't want to. We could take breaks anytime we needed. When it was my turn to introduce myself, I just said my name and that this was my first time coming. My voice came out quieter than I intended. No one pushed me for more details, and I felt relieved when attention moved to the next person. Beth thanked me for being there and said it took courage to show up for the first time. Listening to the other women describe their experiences was both painful and oddly comforting. One woman talked about still checking all her locks obsessively 5 years after her attack. She'd get up multiple times each night to make sure the door was locked even though she'd just checked it. Another woman described having panic attacks in grocery stores when men stood too close behind her in line. She'd abandoned her cart and left the store more times than she could count. Their specific stories were different from mine, but the aftermath sounded so familiar. The constant fear and hypervigilance, the way normal activities became threatening, the exhaustion of being on high alert all the time. When the meeting ended, 2 women approached me gently. They said it gets easier with time. Not better exactly, but more manageable. One of them said she could function now in ways she couldn't imagine 6 months after her attack. I wanted to believe them even though it felt impossible in that moment. I started going to the support group every week. Mostly I just listened, but occasionally I shared small things. The other women offered practical advice about managing triggers and rebuilding a sense of safety. One woman suggested changing my walking route permanently, instead of trying to force myself back to that street. She said reclaiming different spaces felt more empowering than confronting the exact location of trauma. Another woman recommended a self-defense class specifically designed for survivors. She explained it focused on empowerment and rebuilding confidence rather than just learning techniques. These concrete suggestions felt more helpful than vague encouragement to heal or move on. They gave me specific actions I could take instead of just waiting to feel better. 3 weeks after the attack, I managed a short walk around my block during daylight with Jasmine beside me. My heart raced the entire time and I kept scanning every face and shadow. But I made it all the way around without turning back or having a full panic attack. It was such a small thing that used to be completely ordinary. Walking around my own block in broad daylight shouldn't feel like climbing a mountain. But Jasmine treated it like I'd accomplished something huge. She kept saying how proud she was and how this was real progress. Her excitement made me feel less pathetic about celebrating something so basic. She took a selfie of us when we got back to my building and sent it to our parents with the caption that we'd gone for a walk together. Detective Holden called a few days later with what he said was both good and bad news. The good news was they'd identified a suspect based on the pattern of attacks and a partial fingerprint from another crime scene. The bad news was they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him yet. He knew he was watched by police, so he was probably lying low. Holden assured me they were building the case and gathering more evidence. But I could hear the unspoken reality in his voice that this could take months. Or it might never result in charges if they couldn't find enough proof. The uncertainty felt somehow worse than knowing he'd never be caught. At least that would be final. This left me stuck wondering if he was still out there hunting other women, or if he'd eventually face consequences. I had a major setback when I was walking with Wyatt to grab coffee during my lunch break. I saw a man on the street who looked vaguely like my attacker. Same build and same walk. I froze completely in the middle of the sidewalk. I couldn't move or breathe or think. My vision narrowed to tunnel vision focused only on him. Wyatt noticed immediately and gently took my arm. He guided me into a nearby coffee shop before I could completely spiral. The man walked right past the window without even glancing our way. He was completely unaware he'd triggered a full panic response in me. Wyatt sat with me at a corner table until I stopped shaking. He didn't ask questions or try to make me explain. He just ordered me hot tea and sat there quietly present until my breathing returned to normal. In my next therapy session, I told Natalia about the incident. She explained that hypervigilance and false alarms were completely normal parts of trauma response. My brain was trying to protect me by seeing threats everywhere. She taught me techniques to reality test my fear responses in the moment. I should ask myself if this person was actually threatening, or if he just looked similar to the attacker. Were his actions menacing, or was I projecting danger onto a neutral situation? The logic made sense and helped a little. But my body didn't always listen to logic when it was convinced I was in danger. Milo and I tried having a date night at my apartment a few weeks later. We ordered takeout and picked a movie we'd both been wanting to see. It was low pressure and comfortable at first. But then a scene came on showing a woman being followed at night on a dark street. My whole body went rigid and I grabbed the remote to turn it off. Milo was understanding, but I could see the frustration building in him, the exhaustion of constantly having to navigate my triggers and reactions. We ended up talking honestly about whether our relationship could survive this. Neither of us had a clear answer. He said he wanted to be there for me, but he didn't know how much longer he could handle feeling like he was walking through a minefield every day. I told him I understood if this was too much, that I wouldn't blame him if he needed to walk away. We sat in heavy silence for a while before he left, both of us uncertain about what came next. 3 days later, I sat Jasmine down and told her I needed to tell our parents the truth. She looked at me for a long moment and then nodded and pulled out her phone to text them. They arrived at my apartment within 40 minutes. My mom's eyes already red from crying in the car, my dad's face set in that expression he gets when he's trying not to show emotion. We sat in my tiny living room and I told them everything, from the shortcut to the vitamin bottle lie to the hospital examination. My mom started sobbing halfway through and couldn't stop, and my dad just sat there with his hands clenched into fists on his knees, not saying a word. When I finished, my dad stood up and said he was going to find the guy himself, and my mom grabbed my hands and said I was never walking anywhere alone again, that I should move back home where they could keep me safe. Jasmine stepped in before I could respond, and explained that what I needed was support, not protection or revenge. She told them about the therapy and the support group, and how I was working on getting back to normal life. My dad sat back down heavily, and my mom kept holding my hands too tight, but they both listened to Jasmine in a way they probably wouldn't have listened to me right then. 4 weeks after the attack, I went back to work on a modified schedule. My supervisor put me on day shifts only and arranged for someone to always walk me to my car in the parking lot. My coworkers were awkwardly kind in that way people are when they know something bad happened but don't know the details. They brought me coffee and asked careful questions about how I was feeling, and didn't push when I gave vague answers. Wyatt became my unofficial guardian at work, running interference when people got too curious and sitting with me during lunch breaks. He never asked what exactly happened, just made it clear he had my back. Getting back into routine helped more than I expected. Having something to focus on besides checking locks and scanning faces and reliving the attack gave my brain a break from constant fear. The first week was hard, and I had a few moments where I had to lock myself in the bathroom to breathe through panic. But by the second week, I was functioning almost normally during work hours. Detective Holden called on a Tuesday afternoon while I was organizing files in the back office. He said they'd arrested the suspect on an unrelated charge and were using that time to gather more evidence for the assault cases. His voice had this careful optimism in it, like he didn't want to promise anything but thought this might actually lead somewhere. I felt this weird mix of relief and anxiety wash over me. Relief that he was off the streets and couldn't hurt anyone else right now. Anxiety about what came next, about potentially having to testify and see him in court and relive everything in front of strangers. Holden said he'd keep me updated and reminded me I had options about how involved I wanted to be in the prosecution. At my next support group meeting, I finally shared about the vitamin bottle. I'd been going for weeks, but mostly just listening, and this felt like the right time to talk about the thing that had been bothering me most. I explained the HIV lie and the multivitamin bottle, and how I felt guilty about the deception, like I'd done something wrong by lying to save myself. 3 other women immediately related similar stories. One said she'd lied about having a weapon in her purse. Another said she'd pretended to recognize her attacker as her friend's brother and threatened to tell everyone. A third said she'd faked a seizure to get him to back off. The group facilitator explained that survival isn't about honor or honesty. It's about doing whatever works in the moment to stay alive. She said we needed to stop judging our survival tactics by normal moral standards because nothing about those situations was normal. Hearing that permission to let go of the guilt helped more than I expected. Milo came over that weekend and we had a real conversation for the first time in weeks. He admitted he'd been struggling with his own trauma response to my attack. He felt helpless and angry and guilty that he wasn't there to protect me. I realized I'd been so focused on my own processing that I hadn't considered how this affected him. We talked honestly about what we both needed and what our limitations were. He said he wanted to support me but didn't know how. I said I needed patience and space and for him to not take it personally when I couldn't handle physical contact. We agreed to try couples counseling to navigate this together, instead of letting it slowly destroy our relationship. The conversation didn't fix everything, but it felt like a start. A few days later, I attempted my first evening walk. It was still daylight, but later than I'd managed before. Jasmine came with me, and we walked the opposite direction from the attack site, through a busy commercial area with lots of people around. My anxiety spiked when we passed a dark alley entrance and again when a man walked too close behind us. Each time I used the grounding techniques Natalia had taught me, focusing on 5 things I could see, and 4 things I could hear, and 3 things I could feel. We completed the 30-minute loop, and I was exhausted afterward but also proud. It was progress even if it didn't feel like much. One of the support group members had recommended a self-defense class, and I finally signed up. The first session turned out to be different from I expected. The instructor was clear that it wasn't about learning to fight off attackers because physical resistance isn't always safe or possible. Instead, it was about reclaiming bodily autonomy and practicing saying no firmly and learning to trust your instincts about threatening situations. All the other participants were survivors too, which created this safe space to practice without judgment. We did exercises where we practiced yelling no and pushing away imaginary threats and setting physical boundaries. My voice shook the first few times but got stronger. Detective Holden called again 2 weeks later with bigger news. They had enough evidence to charge the suspect with multiple counts of assault and attempted sexual assault. My case was one of 4 they were prosecuting, and mine was the strongest because of all the physical evidence collected that night. He explained the trial process and asked if I was willing to testify. I said yes, even though the thought made me want to throw up. Maybe testifying could prevent him from hunting other women in the future. Maybe it would give the other victims some justice too. I met with the prosecutor the following week to prepare. Her name was Sarah, and she'd handled a lot of assault cases. She was straightforward about what testimony would involve, and didn't sugarcoat how defense attorneys might try to attack my credibility. When I brought up the HIV lie, worried it would make me look dishonest, she didn't even flinch. She said it showed quick thinking under extreme pressure and they'd frame it as a survival tactic, not dishonesty. Her confidence helped ease some of my anxiety about the whole process. Milo and I started couples counseling, and the first session was awkward. Sitting in a room with a stranger trying to explain our relationship problems felt uncomfortable and forced. But the therapist helped us communicate in ways we hadn't been managing on our own. She explained that we were both dealing with trauma, even if mine was more direct. Milo admitted he'd been afraid to touch me or initiate any physical contact because he was worried about triggering me. I admitted I'd been afraid to tell him when I wasn't okay, because I was worried about being too much for him to handle. Having these conversations with someone mediating helped us actually hear each other. We left that first session feeling like maybe we could figure this out together. 2 months after the attack, I decided to try something I'd been working up to for weeks. I planned an evening walk alone through a well-lit commercial area with lots of people around. I left my apartment just before sunset when there was still good light, and the sidewalks were busy with people heading to dinner or walking their dogs. My heart started racing the second I stepped outside and locked my door behind me. Every instinct told me to turn around and go back inside where it was safe. But I made myself keep walking, one foot in front of the other, focusing on the route I'd mapped out earlier. The street was familiar because I'd walked it dozens of times during daylight hours with Jasmine or Wyatt beside me. Now I was doing it alone, and the difference felt huge, even though nothing had actually changed about the location. I passed a coffee shop with people sitting outside and a bookstore that was still open, and a restaurant with a line of customers waiting to get in. Normal evening things happening all around me. My pulse was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were shaking slightly. Every time a man walked past me going the opposite direction, my body tensed up automatically. When someone walked behind me for half a block, my breathing got shallow and quick until he turned down a different street. I used the grounding techniques Natalia had taught me, counting 5 things I could see and 4 things I could hear and 3 things I could feel. The rough texture of my jacket sleeve, the cool evening air on my face, my phone solid and heavy in my pocket. I completed the 30-minute loop without turning back or having a full panic attack. When I got home, I was exhausted and my legs felt shaky, but I'd actually done it. I pulled out my phone and called Jasmine before I could second-guess myself. She answered on the second ring, and I told her I'd just finished my first evening walk alone. She screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. Then she was talking fast about how proud she was and how this was huge progress. Her joy in my small victories never got old. 3 days later, Detective Holden called with news about the trial. The date was set for 3 months out, which meant more waiting and more uncertainty stretching ahead. But he explained that the suspect was being held without bail because of flight risk and the severity of the charges against him. Knowing he was locked up and couldn't hurt anyone else helped me sleep slightly better at night, though I still checked my locks obsessively before bed and startled awake at unexpected sounds from the hallway. I mentioned this to Natalia in our next session, and she reminded me that feeling safer and being completely unafraid were different things. Right now, safer was enough, and I shouldn't expect more from myself. In support group that week, I brought up preparing for trial, and several women who testified in their own cases shared what the experience had been like. One woman said it was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but seeing her attacker convicted brought some sense of closure, even if it didn't erase what happened to her. Another woman described breaking down on the stand but getting through it with support from the victim advocate. A third woman warned me that trials could be re-traumatizing, and I should make sure I had solid support lined up for afterward, not just during. I made a mental note to ask Jasmine to take that day off from the school, and to ask Milo to clear his schedule, so they could both be there. Looking back now, I can see how far I've come, even though I'm not healed and maybe never will be completely. 2 months ago, I couldn't leave my apartment alone or sleep through the night or handle anyone touching me. Now I'm back at work full-time and walking outside regularly during daylight and managing my triggers more effectively. The relationships that got strained by the trauma are slowly rebuilding. The attacker is in custody awaiting trial, and while that doesn't undo what happened, it provides some measure of justice and safety. Milo and I are working through our issues in counseling and reconnecting physically at a pace I control. Jasmine remains my unexpected anchor, her matter-of-fact support more valuable than any amount of sympathy. I still have nightmares several times a week and panic attacks when something catches me off guard. I still check my locks multiple times every night and avoid that residential street entirely, but I'm learning to live with this changed version of myself, instead of fighting to get back to who I was before. The vitamin bottle that saved my life sits in my medicine cabinet now, a strange reminder that survival sometimes requires deception and quick thinking and doing whatever it takes. I'm not the same person who took that shortcut 2 months ago, but I'm still here and still standing, and that counts for something.